In some ways, The Heart of Darkness is generic of its time as a form of exotic Victorian adventure literature that was commonplace and very highly readable to many a Victorian person who simply wanted to hear about the far-off mystical places of the world, all from the comfort of their London suburbs. And even the structure of the story as a story within a story was also something that was becoming more and more a staple of fiction at that time. But far from being just a mere adventure novel, Heart of Darkness, of course, chiefly grapples with the theme of darkness itself, both in the literal sense and in the metaphorical sense. In a literal sense, the Congo River and its unknown locations represents one of the few dark regions of the world that had yet not been plotted on the European map. And metaphorically speaking, it wrestles with the darkness and the degradation of one's moral character that is required for such undertakings, such adventures, and such colonial projects to be undertaken. And this emotional and psychological journey is, of course, most broadly represented by the emotional character journey of the protagonist, Charles Marlow. Now, it's very, very important that at the start of the story, when they're in the ferry just off of Gravesend, that Charles Marlow assumes a meditative Buddhist idol position. Now, I've seen different interpretations of what this could mean. Some people interpret it as the fact that Marlow is being set up as a false idol and therefore an unreliable narrator whose words cannot be trusted. However, my personal feelings on the interpretation are more in line with the fact that it is trying to set Marlow as an individual apart from the Western mindset of the time, right? It's trying to give him some sense of Eastern philosophy, because one of the chief tenets of Buddhism is it requires one to be introspective, that you look within yourself so that you can better understand the world around you. When I was discussing the plot, Marlow goes on that spiel about the fact that, well, what separates us from the Romans, from the mere brutish colonizing conquerors that the Romans were, is that we are saved by efficiency. And what Marlow means when he refers to efficiency is he's talking about the scientific, the Enlightenment system, right? He's talking about rationalism. He's talking about reason. He's saying that the Enlightenment is what sets us apart, what sets our colonialism, what sets our foreign conquests apart from those that were merely just extractive and brutish in more ancient times. And of course, one of the chief aspects of that colonial mindset is that an Enlightenment project is the universality of mankind. That when you look at a piece of work such as arch-imperialist Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden, that what you're dealing with here is a belief that it is the mandate of European and American and white peoples to elevate and raise and paternalistically raise the standards of those who do not already share this heritage, and to expand it so that they too can share the fruits of what the Enlightenment has to offer. And so Marlow looking in is supposed to be converse to the Western rationalist perspective of looking out, looking beyond, and not changing oneself, but changing the world outside of oneself and putting your will upon it, which is very much what the West tried to do in Africa. London itself is portrayed as a very gloomy, very dark, and very confused place. And so it is not merely as black and white, for want of a better way to put it, as Africans and Europeans. Marlow certainly does observe, just as Conrad observed on his expeditions into the Congo, that the Africans were very much, well, he refers to them very much by the European mindset of the time. He refers to them as savages. He recognizes their propensity for cannibalism. But I don't think that what Conrad, the author, is trying to suggest here is that Europeans are uniquely evil. I think he's just suggesting that the attempts to colonize Africa brings with it more evil and more darkness than what can be morally attained from it. As well as London, the other European set piece, which is used very briefly in the tale, is Brussels, of course, in Belgium, the capital of King Leopold II's kingdom. And this is described by Marlow, the character, as a sepulchral city. And this is an allusion to the biblical passage from Matthew chapter 23, verse 27, where Jesus says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanliness." So he's describing the Europeans as hypocrites. He's saying that you have this big, beautiful civilization, but there is this moral corruption in the middle of it that it is all founded on. And this is a criticism, of course, that Conrad, the writer, is specifically throwing towards King Leopold II of Belgium, but generally to the Western European powers themselves. And even though Conrad was very much a British patriot who loved Britain first and foremost and nigh on relinquished every aspect of his Polish identity, who very much assimilated as much as a foreigner could assimilate into the British system, he is still looking at European expansion as an outsider looking in from a Polish perspective. So when Marlow arrives in the Congo, one of the interesting things to note is the character of the men that he meets there. First of all, he only has that position because there was a tribal dispute between one of the Europeans, between this Danish seaman and one of the local tribes, that resulted in the Danishman being killed. Marlow begins this adventure, an adventure that he's wanted to have since his childhood, and he journeys to the Congo, and all of the signs are there initially that it's really going to be a downhill journey from the moment that he arrives. So first of all, he only has a position because a Danishman was killed, and this is what gives the opening, the job opening, for Marlow to then take on. And it's also interesting to note that one of the men mentions the fact that this Danishman who is killed, you would have thought that he was the gentlest soul that ever existed. And yet he very quickly, once he arrives in the Congo, devolves in moral character into being a man who is remarkably abusive to the Africans. And I don't think that this is simply as black and white, for want of a better way to put it, then Europeans bad, Africans good, and the Europeans are simply terrorizing them. I think that what Conrad is trying to get at here is that when you have two civilizations that are at fundamental odds in terms of value and moral hierarchy, the Europeans come from a place of high moral ideals, whereas the Africans are still very much primitive men driven by, the most essential parts of the hierarchy of needs. And therefore, it devolves into a position where the only way that the Europeans can most effectively communicate with the Africans in asserting their moral vision over them is to come down to the Africans' level of violence in order to get them to do what they want, because it's the only language that the Africans will understand. And I think that that broadly is the point that Marlow is making. But he's also saying in there that simply by coming to Africa, you are already having to open your heart to darkness. You're having to let in the darkness of compromising your own morals in order to build and achieve greater civilization. And so when Marlow then later meets one of the first people of note, which is the accountant is dressed like the idealized colonial officer. He's very well groomed, he's very well looked after, and after Marlow meets him, Marlow then goes on to meet the manager, and the manager is supposed to be a very, very average person. And Marlow comments on the fact that he doesn't inspire fear, he doesn't inspire respect. The only thing that he inspires is a general sense of uneasiness. And so already just in the people that he's coming across, you can see how Marlow is becoming disenchanted by the project and by the men, the caliber of men who are actually there in Africa, who was supposed to be building and aspiring to higher ideals. He then goes on to meet the El Dorado expedition, and it becomes obvious that these men are not there for any higher glory, but for mere naked profit. And then finally, the reason that Marlow has this grand obsession with Kurtz is because Kurtz has been spoken of time and time again as this man who has genuine ideals. There's even a passage, I'll just find the quote, where it talks about Kurtz's heritage. The original Kurtz had been educated partly in England, and, as he was good enough to say himself, his sympathies were in the right place. His mother was half English, his father was half French. All Europe contributed to the making of Kurtz, and by I learned that, more appropriately, the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs had entrusted him with the making of a report for its future guidance. So Kurtz is very much the man who embodies the will of the colonial project, of the Enlightenment colonial project, to elevate Africa out of the darkness of uncivilization and to bring it into the European light of expanded Enlightenment civilization. And so Marlow puts all of his hopes into Kurtz and all of his obsessions into him as the man who will redeem this idea. And so Marlow journeys down the snake-like Congo River that will journey for miles and miles down this meandering river. And of course, a snake in the biblical sense is that which is from Eden, that which will deceive and that is based on lies. So Marlow is ferrying himself further down the lie until it's eventually revealed to him that it was all a fantasy. He then finally meets Kurtz. Rather than being someone who has civilized the savages, who has brought them into the European ideal, rather the absolute reverse has happened. He has become one of them. He, totally cut off, totally isolated from Europe, has devolved into a man of only the most acute primal instincts.
If you enjoyed this piece of premium content from the Lotus Eaters, head to our website where you can find more.